Blatter on the way out. FIFA's Ethics Committee has suspended their president for 3 months. Suspended too is Vice President Michel Platini, who has to explain a $2 million payment from Blatter. So what now for the embattled boss of world football? And can FIFA clean up the beautiful game? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Sepp Blatter has been provisionally banned from representing FIFA in any capacity for 90 days. Now, the decision by FIFA's Ethics Committee effectively ends the president's 17-year-long career as the head of world football's governing body. His vice president and possible successor, Michel Platini, he's also been banned, along with FIFA's Secretary-General, Jerome Valcke. So, has another contender for the top job, former Vice President Chung Mung-jun, now banned for 6 years. The suspensions are the latest embarrassment for Blatter, who continues to deny he's linked to major corruption investigations. He's under intense pressure to resign from FIFA's major sponsors and others after US prosecutors indicted FIFA executives. And the Swiss Attorney General opened a criminal investigation into both Blatter and Platini. OK, well, we'll get into a discussion with our guests in just a moment, but first let's talk to Al Jazeera's Andy Richardson. And Andy, is this the end of the career of Sepp Blatter?
I don't think so, not quite, almost. I mean, we have to remember he has already resigned. I'm reminded of his former Director of Communications, Walter de Gregorio, who lost his job a few weeks ago. This is after he made a joke on television saying there's a car containing the FIFA President, the Secretary-General and the Director of Communications. Who's driving? Answer, the police. Now, that was a joke, but it's now becoming disturbingly close to reality. He set up the Ethics Committee, Sepp Blatter, to try and rid FIFA of corruption. It's now ended up suspending him for 90 days, but crucially, it's not a proof of guilt, and it doesn't take us up to February the 26th, when the new presidential election is. So there's a chance he could be back behind his desk before then. He has issued a very bullish statement via his lawyers saying he doesn't believe the Ethics Committee has conducted itself in the correct manner, that he's not had an opportunity to present his version of events. He thinks he could be back by January, and in some way he could hand over power on his own terms.
Sepp Blatter must be the most tenacious man in the world. He's been beset by allegations and suggestions and all sorts of inferences. I mean, he's described himself as a mountain goat who just keeps going on.
Look, we've been talking to his advisors in Zurich, and throughout this process, from the morning on May 27th, when 7 of his top officials were arrested, pulled out of their hotel bedrooms in an exclusive hotel in Zurich just before the FIFA Congress. All the time he's been on the attack, saying that this is an attack on FIFA, it's an attack on football, it's an attack on him. He's come through scandals in the past and survived. This clearly is more serious than anything he's come through before, but even today his advisors saying he's relaxed. The statement he issued via his lawyers was extremely combative, and in his own mind, he has done nothing wrong. He still sees himself as the man who can hand over a legacy of being the man who pushed through meaningful reform at FIFA, and he still believes that. So,
for the meantime, we assume he's at home. Tell us about Michel Platini. Of course, this is the man widely tipped to succeed, and of course, one of his vice presidents.
This is very bad for Platini. He's one of the 3 people that was set to step forward in February as one of the candidates. The fact that he's been suspended for 90 days all but rules him out of the running. The nominations have to be in by October the 26th, at which point the Ethics Committee look at who's gone forward, and they have to pass an integrity test to go forward for that election. If, as he is, he's been banned for 90 days, regardless of whether or not he's guilty or innocent, it's very hard to see how he can pass that integrity test. And you would think already that UEFA and European football is looking for an alternative candidate.
And so their most likely successor at this stage, I know so many things are up in the air, but given that we've got an interim president, a Cameroonian, Issa Hayatou, you say that the nominations need to be in by the 26th of October. how do you see this playing out? Because as far as I can work out, there's only one contender left, Prince Ali bin Al Hussein from Jordan.
Yeah, the FIFA five-a-side team is losing numbers. There's not many people left in the building. Issa Hayatou is the most senior, he's the senior vice president. He's temporarily in power now, but he's already said he won't be putting his name forward for that election in February. Chung Mon-yoon, as we mentioned, he's a fierce opponent of Blatter, but he's been banned for 6 years, so he's out. Platini's in serious trouble. The only man left at the moment is Prince Ali bin Al Hussein of Jordan, who stood against Blatter in May. Came very close to taking him it was a very close election, more closer than Blatter thought. At the moment, he is the only candidate who hasn't had his reputation dragged through the mud. But you think between now and October the 26th, maybe a man who is more acceptable to Blatter, who is Blatter's man, who will take forward FIFA in Blatter's name, maybe someone will step forward who Blatter recommends.
So it's certainly not game over yet, is it?
I still think he's still there. I think he's still got power at FIFA. I think he's still pulling a few strings behind the scenes there.
Andy Richardson, thank you very much indeed. Right, let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Singapore is James Dorsey, author of the blog The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. In Athens, we have Bonita Messiades, the co-founder of A New FIFA Now. That's an organisation which pushes for football reform. Can I start with you then, Bonita? You must be rather happy today then, if you've been pushing for reform or change at FIFA. Sepp Blatter may be down, even if he's not completely out yet.
I think it's promising, Martine, that he has been suspended along with Jerome Valcke and Michel Platini, and that Dr. Chung has received a ban, because it shows that in some respects, that the ethics process is working. However, as I think others have said, Mr. Blatter is one of the great survivors of all time, so one wonders what might be around the corner. But the real issue here is not about suspensions or bans, it's about what is needed so we are not ever in this position again. We have had decades of allegations of financial irregularities and corruption around FIFA, and we should never have got to this point if people had been listened to, whether they be investigative journalists, whether they be former FIFA insiders or whistleblowers from elsewhere in the football world.
And James, in Singapore, just the removal of this top echelon of executives at FIFA doesn't necessarily mean that there is change afoot for the way the institution is run.
I would say at this point, on the contrary, obviously this was a long overdue measure, but it's symbolic. First of all, the person who probably is going to come to replace Sepp Blatter temporarily is Issa Hayatou. He is part of the old guard. He is part of the system. In fact, he's had his own problems in the past and question marks about corruption. So he's not going to be the person who is actually going to fundamentally change the structure of the organization. And that's what really needs to happen.
And what sort of change is likely to come about? We've got registration for candidates for the new presidential elections due later this month in October. Then those elections are scheduled for February. And all the signs are at the moment that we have one candidate, Prince Ali bin Al Hussein of Jordan.
I think that's correct. But I think we need to divide the change, if you wish, into two parts. One is the reforms that FIFA and Sepp Blatter already have announced, which are in and of themselves positive, but to my mind they are secondary. There are two fundamental problems within FIFA. One is the patronage system, which you can resolve by taking out the awarding of the funds to the various national associations and putting that in an independent organization, independent entity that would administer that so that there is no patronage over it. And then there's the second issue, which really has not been discussed and which underlies the financial corruption in my mind, and that's political corruption.
And Bonita, in Athens, does all of this really matter to the game? I mean, this is the most popular game in the world. It's growing in popularity almost every day. Does the antics of men in suits in a boardroom in Zurich, does it really affect the beautiful game?
Look, I think it does, and it matters because it's a question of what kind of society we want to have, or what kind of values we want to teach our children. And if sport is a reflection of society, which I believe it is, as a mother and as someone who's been involved in the game both professionally and as a volunteer, then I think it's also important that sport, and especially a big major sport like this, is run on the grounds of an organisation which has the appropriate accountability, probity, transparency, democracy that we expect of our major institutions and governments around the world. I think the issues that James touches on in terms of the patronage around the financial issues, that goes to the point that I made earlier. And that is, deep within the culture, deep and wide within the culture of FIFA, is this whole system of fear or favour. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And they've forgotten what the game is all about. Their position in the game has become more important than the game itself. And it is addressing those issues. Is it precisely why we need to have independent reform of FIFA. You cannot reform FIFA from within inside the organisation. It's just not capable of it. It doesn't even really have the appetite to do so. And that's why we at New FIFA Now.
All right, but Benita, can we have a look at what could be considered the successes of Sepp Blatter and his 17-year term at FIFA? I mean, he has managed to take the game to all far-flung corners of the world. There's even a goal project in Chad, for instance. I mean, that's pretty much desert, but artificial playing fields have been installed there. Myanmar has become a major player within Asia. Sepp Blatter has managed to extend the reach of football around the world. That surely should be considered one of his successes.
Look, I think that is one of the sad things about what will be his legacy. On the one hand, there have been some enormous successes. The World Cup itself is one. It is the biggest single sporting event in the world, bar none. As you mentioned, there are development projects which have done some good. But as James has mentioned and as I've mentioned, there are also a whole lot of development projects which haven't actually happened, where the money hasn't ended up where it was intended to end up. And more importantly, there are no checks and balances on what happens to those projects. So while the game has generated and increased its revenue enormously, it hasn't necessarily done the right thing development-wise to keep the game going, to get the game growing into where it should be going and how it should be growing. So I think there's both a good side and a bad side to that aspect of Mr. Blatter's legacy.
And James, isn't there an element of inevitability about this? Where there's money, there's greed, and increasingly football has become more commercialised, largely as a consequence of the success of FIFA.
Well, I'm not sure it's inevitable. The temptation is always there, and that's why one puts in proper checks and balances and supervision and auditing, so that if and when something like this happens, you catch it early on. I think part of the problem is, and I agree with Bonita totally, that Sepp Blatter has done good. I think the issue there is, though, just as Bonita said, that soccer and football is a reflection of society. And what you're seeing is, because of the intertwining of politics and football particularly, that FIFA often turns out to be an important prop of autocratic regimes. And that's certainly true in sub-Saharan Africa. It's certainly true in the Middle East and North Africa.
But Benita, aren't we giving perhaps FIFA a hard time when other sports, particularly cycling of late, athletics of late, but virtually every sport, even cricket, has been tainted with the suggestion of corruption, hasn't it? Isn't it part of perhaps an unseemly side of human nature?
Look, Martina, I think one of the things to take note of in relation to those sports that you mentioned, that there are activist groups, just like there is with football, who are trying to reform those sports. And, you know, I mean, it is a popular view to say, well, this is all too difficult because that's how life is, that's how people are, let's not bother doing anything. But we're also not going to get any change, we're not going to get things right, we're not going to get reform, we're not going to have the type of sport which reflects the cultural values and the the other values that we want if we don't try to change it. So I don't accept that that's just the way people are, that's how we should accept it, because not everybody is like that. The vast majority of people in this world are good people and don't want to see FIFA run the way it's been run.
Now, James, the future, can we have a look at how things could go from now if we assume that Sepp Blatter isn't going to be around to exert any influence, shall we say, come presidential elections? How do you think things are going to pan out?
Well, I think that what's going to happen is, if indeed Issa Hayatou, who is the head of the Confederation of African Football, becomes the temporary president president of FIFA for the next 6 months, you're largely going to see a holding operation, possibly implementing some of those reforms that Sepp Blatter had already announced. But it's going to be a waiting game until the election on the 26th of February of a new president. We have a few more weeks to go for people to register themselves as candidates. Obviously, what happened today takes two major candidates out of the picture, and particularly Michel Platini, who was widely seen as a forerunner. And I think that this indeed creates greater opportunity for Prince Ali of Jordan, who has been a long-standing reformer within FIFA. But we also have to see who else may come forward as a candidate.
Tokyo Sexwale, the South African, has been mentioned.
That's true, and obviously he has a tremendous track record within South Africa. However, there are a lot of people who question whether he is too close to the old guard and whether he really has the wherewithal to do what is going to be a major restructuring and overhaul.
Let's talk a little bit more then about the detail of what the restructuring and overhaul should be. How should FIFA be run in order to prevent the system of patronage that you've described to us earlier?
The two issues are this. The patronage issue is that Sepp Blatter indeed has made FIFA a economically or commercially very viable enterprise. Those funds are used for, obviously, the operation, the cost of the operation of FIFA, as well as for the development of football across the globe, and particularly in countries that are in need of development. What happens is it's basically Sepp Blatter and the FIFA management that hands those funds out. And many who get those funds are extremely grateful and are therefore supportive of the leadership of FIFA, irrespective of whether or not they are critical of that leadership. So what you really need to do is take the distribution of those funds out of FIFA, put it into a independent entity, in which FIFA would be one representative on the board of that entity, and they independently would be distributing these funds with a clear, transparent checks and balances.
Now,
I think the other thing that one has to do.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask you, James, what role you think perhaps the major sponsors could play in this? Because, of course, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Visa, Budweiser, they've all expressed themselves rather clearly, haven't they? Their displeasure at Sepp Blatter's conduct of affairs. What role could they play in terms of keeping funds and allocating them to the deserving projects and making sure that those funds actually get there?
Well, the logical thing to do, if you were to set up a separate entity that would be distributing these funds, that it would be governed by the stakeholders. The stakeholders being, on the one hand, FIFA, but on the other hand, the sponsors, the players, the fans, and therefore, with other words, this is a game of multiple stakeholders, and until now, those stakeholders have not really been playing a role.
OK, we can bring in Gary Al Smith now, who's joining us from the Ghanaian capital, Accra. And Gary is Ghana editor for SuperSport, Africa's largest sport network. And Gary, for the people of Africa, for the football lovers, I mean, I know there are so many, it's a football-crazy continent, isn't it? Is Sepp Blatter a villain or a visionary?
Well, it depends on where you are. About 6 months ago, that question would have been easy to answer because at the time, he was seen mainly as a hero because of the projects like you discussed on your show he had been able to bring to this side of the world. However, in the intervening time, with all the evidence that has been shown by the Western media, especially with the projects, with the corruption allegations and things like that, it's been difficult to look beyond the narrative that he has presided over a very corrupt regime. So what a lot of people are saying is that maybe he was a friend of Africa all these years. However, probably if he were more transparent, the continent would have gotten more. So I think it's a bit of a mixed reception to all that's going on.
And yet, Gary, I think I even heard you on the radio in Ghana defending FIFA and Sepp Blatter not that long ago. And of course, you've got to acknowledge that Africa is one of the parts of the world that has benefited so much from the Blatter presidency. I've earlier mentioned a project in Chad, for instance. So many people are grateful to Sepp Blatter for having brought football and facilities to their part of the world, not least, of course, South Africa in the World Cup.
Which is why I started by saying that it depends on where you're asking. And I also said that 6 months ago, the answer would have been an unequivocal no to that question. However, I mean, in the intervening time, it's pretty difficult because you've had, a $10 million allegation against him. You've had the issues with Jerome Valcke. You've had issues with other people that have come up. And it's pretty difficult to look beyond those ones to say that he has not presided over a corrupt regime. So you can never take away the fact that Sepp has brought a lot of developmental projects to Africa. However, the big question is, did he give Africa a pittance based on the numbers of corrupt dealings we've seen and all that, or did he really serve Africa the way it was supposed to be served? So today, if you go onto the streets, people are going to say that yes, he was a friend of Africa. However, probably the continent deserved more. So yes, you heard me defending him a couple of months ago. However, we are in a system where evidence is the name of the game. We didn't have as much evidence as we had 6 months ago as we have now, you have to understand. And so right now, if you ask me, I'll say that, well, probably it's good riddance because he may have done more harm than good to us.
And James, in Singapore, I mean, one of the attributes, if you like, of FIFA currently is the egalitarian nature of the way it's run, insofar as a tiny country like Mauritius would have equal standing with an enormous country like the United States.
That's correct, but I don't personally have an issue with that. With other words, I don't think one should discriminate against states because they are small or not as large as some of the major football powerhouses. And where that voice comes out is in the General Congress of FIFA, which is annual, which is going to, in February, elect a new president. But I think coming back to what Gary said, and I think he's absolutely right, but both the Congress that re-elected Blatter in May of this year, as well as what you're seeing in Africa, is a reflection of the enormous divide between the governors of the sport and the actual players and the fans of the sport. With other words, public opinion has without question turned against Blatter and his cohorts. But I think that certainly before the announcement today, that many of the African heads of football associations would have spoken out in favor of Blatter simply because of the patronage system.
James Dorsey in Singapore, Gary Al Smith in Accra, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And of course, thank you to Bonita Merciades, who joined us earlier. And thank you, as ever, for watching. You can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the entire team, it's bye for now.